The officer didn't knock. He couldn't. His hands were shaking too violently, his knuckles white, his breath uneven, the file he carried trembling like it was alive. In the long, dim corridor of the Wolfschanz bunker, even the guards noticed it. No officer returned from Hamburg with steady hands. Not after what they had seen. He pushed the door open. Inside, the bunker felt smaller than usual. The air was stale, suffocating, thick with cigarette smoke, damp concrete, and fear. The walls seemed to lean inward, as if they too listened. Hitler was seated at the long wooden table, surrounded by his top generals. Maps covered every inch. Lines, arrows, notes. All meaningless now. Because the officer who stepped in looked like a man who had just walked out of hell. The generals fell silent. Even Goebbels stopped scribbling. Everyone sensed it. This man had seen something no German officer should ever have to witness. His boots left small trails of mud and ash on the bunker floor. His uniform was singed at the edges. The tips of his collar looked burned. Whoever retrieved those papers from Hamburg had done so through streets that barely existed anymore. He opened his mouth to speak. No sound came out. Hitler didn't blink, didn't lean back, didn't scowl. He simply stared at the officer with the quiet, unsettling stillness of a man who already knew the answer and wanted to hear it anyway. Finally, with a voice that barely existed, the officer whispered, "My Führer." Hamburg is gone. A dead silence crushed the room. The only sound was the faint hum of the bunker lights. Goebbels' pen slipped from his hand. Keitel's jaw tightened. Giotto's eyes widened as if the sentence itself punched him. But Hitler didn't move. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. There was no fear in his voice. No shock, just a cold curiosity. How many? Not how. Not why. Not who survived. Just 2 words. How many? The officer hesitated. His throat worked in slow, painful motions. Sweat rolled down his face even though the bunker was freezing. And then he spoke the number. 40,000. Civilians. Gasps rippled through the room. A general actually took a step backward. Someone whispered a prayer under their breath. But Hitler? Hitler didn't even blink. Instead, he smiled. A small smile. A thin smile. But a smile. And that smile terrified the men in that bunker more than the destruction of an entire German city. Because in that moment, they realized that something darker than the flames of Hamburg had just been lit inside him. The officer handed over the scorched file. Hitler opened it slowly, flipping through pages that should have made any leader break down. But he looked at the charred photographs with the same expression he might give a weather forecast. Blackened streets, families burned together, melted fire brigades. Children curled into the pavement frozen in their final moment. Nothing stirred in his face. He turned the page. Another. Not a flicker. Behind him, Goebbels swallowed hard. This wasn't the reaction he expected. He expected rage. A collapse. A table flipped. A breakdown. Something human died, but Hitler's calm was worse. It was inhuman. A general finally whispered, "My Führer." 40,000 civilians. Hitler closed the file gently. As expected. A chill ran through the room. As expected? No one had expected this. Not the scale. Not the intensity. Not a firestorm that created its own hurricane, its own oxygen vacuum that ripped people from the ground and hurled them into flames. But Hitler said it like he'd been waiting for it. He stood slowly, walked toward the massive wall map, and placed a single finger on Hamburg, pressing so hard the paper wrinkled. "The British wanted vengeance for Berlin," he said softly. "Now they have tasted their own medicine." A general stepped forward, voice shaken. "My Führer." These were German civilians. Hitler didn't turn around. "They were Germans," he replied, "and they died for Germany." The coldness of his tone sucked the air out of the room. A few men exchanged horrified glances. This wasn't grief. This was calculation. Another officer tried to speak. "Sir, entire districts have vanished." "Whole families." Hitler cut him off with a gentle hand wave. almost polite. And their deaths will harden the nation. He began pacing, each footstep echoing sharply in the bunker. They bomb London, he murmured. They bomb Coventry. They cheer when German children burn. He stopped, turned. And now they are shocked that we bleed? No one answered, because no one dared. Hitler walked back to the table, placed the scorched file on it, and rested his hand on it like he was making a vow. 40,000 dead, he said softly. This is not a tragedy. The general stiffened. This, Hitler continued, is a message. Silence swallowed the bunker. A general finally whispered, a message. To whom? Hitler's smile returned. That same unsettling curve. To everyone, he whispered. To the Allies, to the German people. To those who believe Germany will break. He stepped toward the bunker door, the shadows stretching around him like they feared touching him. Just before leaving, he turned his head slightly and said the sentence that haunted everyone who heard it. When a city burns, a nation awakens. And now, Germany is awake. The door closed behind him. No one spoke. No one breathed. Because in that suffocating silence, the generals realized the truth. The Allies had burned Hamburg, but Hitler was about to burn something far bigger. The door had barely closed behind Hitler when every general in the room finally remembered how to breathe. Chest rose, shoulders dropped, eyes darted. Even the bunker walls felt like they loosened their grip for a moment. But the officer who delivered the report, the man who had seen Hamburg with his own eyes, did not breathe. He stepped backward until his spine hit the concrete wall. His hands were still trembling. His pupils were wide, wild, unfocused dot, and then he whispered, voice cracking, he didn't react. He didn't react at all. 40,000 dead. And he didn't react. A general beside him muttered, you saw him smile. Another added, that wasn't calm. That was something else. Every man in that room had served under Hitler through triumphs and disasters. They had seen him furious, ecstatic, paranoid, broken. But this was new. This was terrifying, because the thought began spreading through the bunker like smoke from a burning city. If Hamburg couldn't shock Hitler, then nothing could. And a leader who can no longer be shocked, can order things that no sane mind would even consider. The silence after Hitler's exit felt heavier than anything they had felt during the war. It wasn't just fear. It was realization that he had changed. Finally, Goebbels, still pale, still shaking, reached for the scorched file. He opened it with shaky fingers, flipping through the photos again, as if hoping they would show something else. They didn't. Blackened silhouettes. Collapsed buildings. Bodies stacked beside roads like shadows stripped from the earth. He closed the file, pressing his palm against it as if trying to push the images out of existence. This will break the country, he whispered. Himmler shook his head immediately. It will harden it, another general disagreed. No, our people are exhausted. After Leningrad, after the ration cuts, after Stalingrad, they have nothing left. This will crush morale. Their voices rose in fear-filled murmurs that echoed off the bunker walls. But above every doubt hung one chilling fact. Hitler didn't care. Before anyone could speak again, hurried footsteps echoed from the hall. A young officer burst into the room, cheeks red, boots muddy, uniform still dusted with ash from his trip. He saluted sharply. New updates from the rescue team, sirs. Everyone froze. The officer's throat tightened. His voice trembled. The firestorm. It was worse than we thought. A general leaned forward. How much worse? The officer swallowed hard. Sir, the air got so hot it created a vacuum. People were sucked off the streets, pulled into the flames. Gasps filled the room. He continued, voice thinning to a whisper. They said the streets melted. The wind was so strong it ripped doors from hinges. Entire neighborhoods vanished in minutes. Someone muttered, that's impossible. But the officer shook his head. It happened, sir. The fire created its own storm. It dragged people into it. There was no running, no hiding. A general asked, did you speak to survivors? The officer hesitated. Sir, there aren't many. Silence punched the air out of the room. Even Goebbels, who could twist disasters into propaganda miracles, went gray. Then came the question everyone dreaded. What did Hitler say when you told him? The officer looked toward the door, as if Hitler's presence still poisoned the hallway. He said, "They deserved it." A suffocating silence settled over the table. Not even the lights buzzed. A general finally spoke, his voice hollow. What does he plan to do? No one answered. Because everyone feared the same terrifying truth. Hitler wasn't thinking about Hamburg. He was thinking about retaliation. The bunker shifted. Discussions turned frantic. Not because they wanted revenge, but because they needed to guess what Hitler would order next. Himmler broke the silence. He will want reprisals increased. If he thinks the British crossed a line, Goebbels cut him off. Crossed a line. He believes they opened a new kind of war. A field marshal shook his head, rubbing his temples. If he orders a massive retaliation, Berlin will be bombed to dust within weeks. Dresden will fall. Munich, Cologne, every German city will be wiped out. Another added, and he won't stop. The man who smiled at 40,000 dead won't stop at anything. The officer who delivered the news suddenly spoke calmly, clearly, as if something inside him had snapped into focus. Hitler is not thinking about Germany's pain, he said. He's thinking about his pride. Every general froze because they knew it was true. Hitler didn't see the corpses in Hamburg. He saw a challenge. He didn't see the destroyed neighborhoods. He saw an insult, and when Hitler felt insulted, millions bled. The conversation died instantly when footsteps approached. Slow, heavy, controlled, not running, not panicked, measured. The men in the bunker stiffened, shoulders snapping straight, hands flattening against their trousers. They recognized those footsteps. Hitler was returning. The door opened. He stepped in. His face was unreadable. No rage, no grief, no fear. Just calculation. A sharp, cold intelligence that made even his closest men look away. He scanned every face, slowly, deliberately, letting the silence squeeze the breath out of their lungs. Finally he spoke. Gentlemen, he said softly, the world has set this fire. He stepped further inside. Now, we will show them what happens when Germany burns. No one dared reply, because they all understood the Allies had burned the city. But Hitler was preparing to burn the war. The road to Moscow had turned into a graveyard of burned-out trucks and frozen bodies. The cold didn't care who they belonged to, German or Soviet. It buried them all the same. General Rokossovsky stood over a mat lit by a single lantern. His breath fogged the air as he spoke, each word heavy, controlled, but hiding the weight of the impossible. We hold here, he said quietly. The officers around him exchanged uncertain glances. Here? This shattered trench line? This patch of frozen mud that barely qualified as a position? A sudden blast shook the dugout. Snow dust rained from the ceiling. Someone cursed. Someone prayed. Someone checked their rifle as if the weapon could stop fear. Outside, the German loudspeakers screamed again taunts, threats, demands for surrender. No one listened anymore. They had heard these voices for weeks. Voices that promised warmth, food, mercy, lies. A young Soviet soldier, barely 19, tightened his scarf around his face. He looked toward the distant forest where the Germans were gathering. He had been fighting since Smolensk. His hands never stopped shaking anymore, except when he fired. A column of T-34s crawled forward from the mist, armor coated in frost so thick they looked carved from ice. Engines growled like starving beasts. Men on top hammered their tracks clean, cursing the cold that locked steel like glue. From the west, faint thunder rolled German artillery adjusting for the kill. Each distant boom echoed like the promise of doom. Rokossovsky stepped outside, boots sinking into the icy crust. He watched the horizon burn orange for a moment. Then he whispered, "They think Moscow will fall tonight." A junior officer swallowed hard. "And will it?" Rokossovsky didn't answer immediately. He stared at the frozen earth, the mangled trees, the smoke drifting like ghosts. He thought of the civilians evacuating with their children wrapped in blankets. He thought of the factories still hammering out weapons through the night. He thought of the men who were already dead and the ones who would die by morning. He finally spoke. "Only if we let it." Far ahead, the first German flares went up white, harsh, blinding. The night turned to false daylight as hundreds of soldiers moved like shadows across the snow. The attack had begun. Machine guns opened, ripping through the silence. The trench line lit up with muzzle flashes. Screams followed. Snow turned dark. A T-34 roared forward, firing point-blank into a cluster of advancing infantry. The shell exploded, tossing bodies like rag dolls. Another tank erupted in flame as a German shell pierced its side. The battlefield became a storm of fire and ice. The young soldier found himself kneeling, hands numb, rifle slipping. A shadow lunged at him, German, shouting, bayonet raised. He reacted on instinct. One shot. The man fell face first into the snow, sliding until his helmet rolled off silently. The boy stared at him. He didn't feel triumph. He didn't feel hate. He felt nothing. His commander grabbed his shoulder. "Back up! Fall back to the second line!" But there was barely any second line left. As the Soviets pulled back, the Germans surged forward unstoppable, disciplined, confident. For a moment it seemed the Red Army would break completely. And then a sound rose from behind the ridge. A sound every soldier knew, a sound that could change a battle. Engines, dozens of them, roaring like an approaching storm. The reinforcements were here. Not enough to guarantee victory. Not enough to push the Germans back. But enough to make the Germans hesitate. And in this war, a second of hesitation could save a city. The reinforcements came crashing through the tree line like steel monsters waking from hibernation. Snow blasted off their hose as the engines roared, the ground trembling under their weight. Every Soviet soldier turned at the sound-exhausted eyes sparking, with something they had not felt in days. HOP ET-34s and KV-1 South rode into formation, their silhouettes looming like giants against the burning horizon. Infantry clung to their sides, rifles tucked close, faces wrapped in scars of frost. A German officer raised his binoculars. His breath froze mid-air. He had expected broken resistance, scattered defenders, the final thinning of Soviet lines. Instead, he saw tanks, more than the reports had warned, more than he believed the Soviets could still field. For the first time that night, the German advance faltered. Rokossovsky spotted the armored column and exhaled slowly. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. But a tension loosened in his shoulders. "We're not dead yet," he murmured. The battlefield shifted instantly. The Soviet tanks fired first rounds, shrieking across the frozen field, smashing into German positions. The explosion sent geysers of snow and dirt into the air, silhouettes flying with them. German panzers answered, their own cannons booming like iron thunder. The sky flashed white, orange, black. Over and over again, AKV-1 took a direct hit, armor dented but not pierced. It kept moving slow, unstoppable like a walking fortress. Behind it, Soviet infantry poured forward, their boots pounding the snow, screams swallowed by the chaos. The German machine guns opened up. Men fell. Others stepped over them. There was no time to mourn. No time to think. Only to move. A Soviet sergeant grabbed a fallen comrade's DP machine gun and fired from the hip, spraying a line of bullets that carved through the enemy like a saw. Casings spilled into the snow, hissing as they cooled. Bombs fell from above, Stukas diving with their terrible sirens cutting through the night. Soviet men ducked, some covering their ears, others firing upward in defiance. A pair of them exploded, ripped apart by flat cannons hidden in the forest. The Germans weren't expecting this much resistance, and they weren't prepared for a fight this. Desperate, Rokossovsky's radio crackled. "Command requests a status update. Are the lines holding?" He stared at the battlefield, at the tanks burning, at the men fighting like cornered wolves, at the Germans still pushing, relentless, brutal. He pressed the radio button. "They're holding," he said. Then after a beat, "For now, in Moscow." Factory workers tightened their belts and continued assembling rifles by hand, their fingers numb, their eyes burning from smoke. They didn't know which front needed their weapons. They didn't ask. They just built. The city was still breathing. But on the front, German reinforcements arrived, more infantry, more panzers, more trucks loaded with ammunition. The balance shifted again. The Soviets weren't being pushed back, they were being crushed inch by inch. A tank commander shouted from his hatch, face blackened with soot, "Advance! Don't let them reorganize!" His T-34 surged forward, and an 88mm shell turned it into a rising tower of flame. The blast knocked soldiers off their feet. The shockwave rolled like a physical fist through the trenches. The Germans counterattacked with everything they had. The line began to bend, crack, crack dot, every second closer to breaking. A Soviet lieutenant crawled through the snow, blood dripping from his ear, shouting over the roar of artillery, "Hold! Just hold a little longer!" Because somewhere behind them, somewhere deep in the snowy darkness, another force was coming. A force neither side had fully counted on, a force that didn't care about strategy or maps or the number of guns. The winter dot, and with every passing minute, it grew stronger. The temperature fell so fast, it felt like the air itself was turning to glass. Breath didn't fog anymore, it crystallized. Cloth froze stiff. Steel screamed when touched. German soldiers felt it first. Not the bullets, not the shells. The cold. It crept into gloves, crawled up sleeves, bit through boots, numbed fingers until rifles slipped from hands. Men tried to speak, but their lips stuck together. Voices cracked into silence. Engines failed. Fuel thickened like tar-dot tank treads, froze against the snow, locked solid. A panzer commander slammed his hatch shut and shouted at his crew, but the engine behind him coughed, sputtered, and died. One by one, German machines became statues of steel. Rokossovsky watched from a ridge, scarf whipping in the rising wind. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate dot, but he understood. The winter had chosen its side. Soviet troops felt the cold. God! They felt it, but they were wrapped in fur hats, padded jackets, layers of wool dot. They had fires. They had sleds. Dot they had experience. They had survived nights colder than this. The Germans had not. The battlefield felt eerily quiet, no engines, no shouting, only the howl of the wind sweeping across the frozen plain like a beast searching for prey. A Soviet scout sprinted up to Rokossovsky, gasping, "They're stuck! Their armor!" "It can't move," Rokossovsky nodded once. "Then we move." The order spread like wildfire. Soviet infantry surged forward slow at first, then faster as they realized the front was collapsing. Men who had been fighting defensively for weeks suddenly felt the ground shift beneath them. They weren't holding anymore, they were pushing. T-34s rolled down the slopes, their diesel engines kicking awake even in the brutal cold. Their tracks tore through the snow unchallenged, unmatched. A German machine gunner tried to fire, but his weapon jammed frozen solid. He beat it with his fist until his skin split open. A T-34 shell landed beside him. There was nothing left to freeze. German officers shouted for order, for positions, for fire discipline, but their commands were swallowed by panic, wind, and the cracking of ice. The Soviets closed in. Grenades exploded inside trenches. Bayonets flashed like silver teeth. Flamethrowers turned the dark into a burning orange dawn. The Red Army didn't advance like soldiers. They advanced like survivors. Every step was revenge for villages burned, for families lost, for the terror of the past months. The Germans broke. Not all at once, not loudly, but quietly, fearfully, as men realized the truth. They would not reach Moscow. They would not claim the city. They would not survive the winter. The retreat began in fragments, one unit pulling back, another abandoning its guns, another running without waiting for orders. Vehicles left behind, ammunition dumped. Wounded soldiers carried until their carriers collapsed from cold. Night fell again. But the Soviets kept advancing. Rokossovsky stood beside a burning wreck, heat warming half his face, frost freezing the other half. He stared across the snow at the long, dark column of German forces withdrawing under the pale moonlight. A junior officer approached, shivering. "Comrade General, is it over?" Rokossovsky watched a T-34 climb a ridge and raise its turret toward the fleeing enemy. He watched Soviet infantry plant their rifles like flags in the conquered snow. He watched the winter swallow the German tracks as if erasing them from the earth. "No," he said quietly, "but tonight, Moscow lives." Behind him, the eastern sky glowed with the faint, distant lights of the city that had refused to die. A city that had waited, prayed, fought, frozen, bled, and endured. The battle wasn't finished. The war wasn't won. But the impossible had happened. The gates of Moscow had held, and from that night on, Germany would never again stand so close. The tide had begun to turn. In fire, in blood, in ice. And in the unbreakable will of a city that refused to fall,